She destroyed what we built. I just cleaned up the wreckage.
Before Mark Wallace became the successful owner of a thriving warehouse business, his life was defined by a modest upbringing and relentless ambition. Born to working-class parents in a small industrial town, Mark was no stranger to hard work. Summers were spent helping his father at a local factory, and winters were dedicated to excelling in school, fueled by dreams of a future beyond the confines of his hometown. By the time he finished college with a degree in business, he was determined to carve out his own path in the logistics industry. Mark's first foray into the workforce brought him to Timmins Electronics, a company specializing in advanced automation systems for mechanical operations. It was here that Mark's aptitude for operations shone, and it wasn't long before he caught the eye of both management and a charming coworker named Willa. Their connection was instant, sparking a romance that quickly deepened into a relationship filled with shared aspirations. However, what began as a promising partnership would eventually face challenges neither of them could have foreseen. Mark Wallace sat in his office at the warehouse, grappling with the undeniable truth. His wife, Willa, was having an affair with her boss, Dale Timmins. The evidence lay before him, making it impossible to dismiss his suspicions. Dale owned Timmins Electronics, a company specializing in electronic controllers used to automate mechanical systems of various sizes. Mark had met Willa while working at Timmins Electronics, where their romance blossomed. They married, and a few years later, Mark pursued his dream of opening independent warehouses, a risky venture at the time. Willa supported him by tightening their budget, even during tough times when mac and cheese dinners were the norm. Together, they built a thriving business, and by age 35, Mark owned 4 massive warehouses with additional land for expansion. His facilities were cutting edge, with one refrigerated warehouse large enough to freeze truckloads of meat without unloading, saving time and labor for clients. Willa, however, seemed increasingly distant. Once a team, their marriage now felt like a hollow partnership. She worked as Dale's personal assistant, a role that consumed her time and energy. Although they had once dreamed of having children, Willa now dismissed the idea entirely. Mark couldn't understand her change of heart, especially since they'd once planned names and imagined their family's future. Their intimacy had suffered too, reduced to infrequent, passionless encounters that left Mark feeling more like a chore than a partner. The divide between them grew wider with each passing day. Conversations dwindled to near silence, meals were spent in awkward quiet, and Willa showed little interest in Mark's business successes, as long as the bills were paid. Years ago, she had opened a separate bank account for her earnings, and while she contributed to household expenses, she used her money for personal needs like spa visits and shopping. Mark managed the rest, keeping their shared business accounts out of sight in his corporate offices. Despite their growing distance, Willa maintained her role as the go-to person at Timmins Electronics, often traveling with Dale for business. While Mark had no concrete evidence of an affair, her emotional withdrawal and reluctance to discuss children raised red flags. Though Willa answered his calls promptly during trips and never seemed flustered, her changed behavior at home painted a troubling picture. Mark decided it was time to get answers. Using corporate funds, he hired a private investigator to follow Willa and Dale. He knew Willa rarely glanced at the business accounts, so she was unlikely to notice. Their shared history with Dale added another layer of complexity. Dale not only rented space in one of Mark's warehouses, but also hosted regular company events that Mark attended alongside Willa. Picnics, holiday parties, and even a pheasant hunt kept them socially connected, though Willa merely organized the outings, rarely participating. Dale's own marriage didn't seem ideal. His wife, Gretchen, had given him 3 children, but no longer maintained her youthful figure, a stark contrast to Willa's slim and polished appearance. It wasn't hard for Mark to imagine Dale being drawn to Willa, but the thought filled him with dread. At 35, Mark felt the weight of time pressing on him. He still longed for children, but Willa's disinterest and their marital struggles made him question whether it would ever happen. If their marriage failed, starting over would mean years before he could build a new relationship stable enough for parenthood. The clock was ticking, and Mark feared his dream of becoming a father might slip away for good. As he sat in his office, Mark resolved to uncover the truth. Whatever came next, he needed clarity about Willa, their marriage, and his own future. Mark hired a private security service called Security One, a company known for handling everything from cybersecurity to background checks and site security. After making an appointment, he met with Chris Couples, the owner, at their office. Chris greeted him with coffee and a friendly demeanor. "What brings you here today, Mark?" Chris asked. "Usually you just call if there's an issue with one of my guards. Have you had a breach?" Mark chuckled dryly. "Not the warehouses or the network. Everything's secure on that front." He paused, sighing heavily. "It's my wife, Willa. Things between us aren't the same anymore. She's distant, uninterested in having kids, and our intimacy life is non-existent. I don't have proof, but I think she might be seeing someone. Maybe her boss, Dale Timmons. I'm starting to feel like I'm just here to pay the bills." Chris listened intently, knowing that when suspicions like this arose, there was often truth behind them. However, any investigation would need to be discreet to avoid irreparable damage to the marriage. "I've got an excellent investigator," Chris said. "Her name's Lisa, and she's meticulous, great at uncovering infidelity and anything else suspicious. She could take this on." Mark nodded, agreeing Lisa would be a good fit. Chris raised a concern, though. "We do patrol security for Timmons Electronics, so there's a potential conflict of interest. Let me check with my lawyer." After a brief phone call, Chris confirmed they could proceed as long as the investigation stayed personal and didn't involve the businesses. Mark agreed to pay privately from his savings rather than through company funds, ensuring no paper trail that Willa might stumble upon. With the investigation underway, Mark felt a mix of relief and apprehension. He carried on as usual, coexisting with Willa in their quiet, strained marriage. They shared a bed, but little else. No meaningful conversations, no intimacy, and no further discussions about having children. Mark retreated into himself, contemplating a future without Willa. Lisa began her work going undercover at Timmons Electronics. Her task was to observe Willa's relationship with Dale and identify any irregularities. Chris kept Mark updated. Though progress was slow, investigations required patience, and Mark braced himself for whatever might come. Months later, Chris called Mark in to review the findings. The report was thorough, with transcripts of emails, texts, and phone calls, as well as video evidence from out-of-town trips. The conclusion was clear. Willa and Dale were having an affair. The transcripts revealed not only their romantic involvement, but also disparaging remarks Willa made about Mark, including criticisms of his performance as a husband. Dale, in turn, complained about his wife, Gretchen, framing their affair as an escape from unhappy marriages. Mark was devastated. Beyond the personal betrayal, he faced practical challenges. Willa was a co-owner of his business, and a divorce could force him to buy out her share, potentially jeopardizing everything he had built. The local economy's strength meant the business was highly valuable, great for operations but disastrous in a divorce settlement. Unsure of his next move, Mark wrestled with painful questions. Should he confront Willa and try to salvage their marriage, walk away quietly and start over, divorce her outright and risk losing the business? Should he tell Gretchen about Dale's infidelity, knowing it might escalate the situation? The weight of these decisions left Mark overwhelmed. One evening, a severe headache and nausea forced him to rest. For the first time in a long while, Willa showed concern. She made him soup from scratch, kept the house quiet, and checked on him periodically. Mark appreciated her effort, but couldn't help wondering why she suddenly cared. Was it guilt or something else? As his headache subsided, Mark began plotting his next steps. He decided against telling Gretchen directly, opting instead to reveal Willa and Dale's affair publicly when the time was right. For now, planning, even extreme and unlikely scenarios, was a healthier outlet than despairing over his broken marriage. That night, he fell asleep, imagining how he would expose Willa and her lover to the world. Mark woke the next morning feeling unusually upbeat. Glancing at Willa, still asleep beside him, he allowed himself a rare smile. For the first time in months, his mood was lighter, and his body even reflected it. After shaving and showering, he dressed and gently woke Willa. "Thanks for last night. I feel like a new man," he said, kissing her cheek before heading to the kitchen for breakfast. Willa, groggy, eventually joined him for coffee. Their conversations had been strained for months, but Mark was unusually animated as he shared his plans to move forward with constructing a new warehouse. The project had been delayed while waiting for a big box retailer to commit to leasing the space, but Mark decided it was time to take the risk. "Every warehouse we've built was a gamble, and they've all paid off," he reminded her. Willa, though hesitant, conceded. Mark's instincts about Wallace warehouses had proven right before. The decision wasn't just business for Mark, it was strategic. He set the wheels in motion, bringing in his trusted manager, Kelly Parsons, to oversee construction, and then visited his attorney. While updating his will and corporate succession plan, Mark ensured that if something happened to him, Willa would retain ownership of the business's profits, but have no control over its operations. Kelly would take over as CEO, and safeguards would prevent Willa from draining the company's assets. Mark wanted to secure the future of his business, even if their marriage was beyond saving. Quietly, Mark also began preparing for another phase of his plan. Over several weeks, he discreetly withdrew small amounts of money from the company, eventually accumulating $10,000. He also acquired supplies, including needles from a veterinary store, under the guise of a livestock producer. Using public library computers to avoid suspicion, he researched the details he needed for his scheme. At home, Mark maintained a facade of warmth. Willa seemed to respond, even initiating intimacy a couple of times. The rekindled physical connection was bittersweet for Mark, who suspected it was too little, too late. He chose to indulge, reasoning it might be a long time before he experienced such closeness again. The couple attended Timmins Electronics' spring celebration together. The event featured games, a buffet, and prizes for employees and their families. Mark kept his interactions light, even chatting with Dale's wife Gretchen, while avoiding Dale himself. When Willa briefly disappeared with Dale during the evening, Mark noticed but refrained from confronting her. The night ended quietly, with Willa withdrawing into her usual aloofness at home. As construction on the new warehouse progressed, Mark took the next step in his plan. Late one night at the office, he used the needle and tubing he'd purchased to draw his own blood. He had hesitated, unsure if he could pull it off, but rationalized that others managed similar tasks regularly. Following instructions he'd found online, he used a tourniquet, swabbed the site with alcohol, and carefully inserted the needle. Relief washed over him when blood flowed steadily into the plastic bag he'd prepared. He stopped after extracting a pint, knowing he needed to stay physically capable for what lay ahead. Mark's scheme was underway. Though the full scope of his plan remained in his mind, each step brought him closer to its execution. His marriage might have been crumbling, but Mark was determined to control his narrative and his future. Mark carefully filled the blood bag, clamping the tubing with locking pliers once he had enough. After removing the needle, he applied pressure to the puncture site and was relieved to see no bruising. He decided against using a bandage to avoid Willa noticing anything unusual. He had considered using animal blood for his plan, but dismissed it. DNA tests would quickly expose the ruse. Human blood, specifically his own, was essential for success. To prevent clotting, he researched anticoagulants and discovered that rat poison contained the necessary chemicals. He purchased a box of poison, carefully adding small amounts to the blood through trial and error. Once prepared, the bag was locked in his mini-fridge at the office, ensuring no one could stumble upon it. Mark cleaned and dried the needle and tubing for later use, knowing he'd need more blood to complete his scheme. That evening, he set the next steps into motion. Using Willa's email, he created a profile in her name to apply for a $1 million life insurance policy on himself. Then, he began making calls to family, friends, and even Willa's co-workers, including Dale Timmins. "Dale, I'm planning a surprise birthday party for Willa at our house on the 18th, Mark said. "Could you spread the word to your employees and help keep her occupied that evening? Bring her home around 7? Dale eagerly agreed, not suspecting a thing. Mark's plan was coming together, but the irony wasn't lost on him. He knew Willa would likely return from her birthday surprise with Dale stained by their affair, a detail confirmed by his investigators' reports. In the following days, Mark arranged for a caterer, a birthday cake, and a thoughtful gift. Meanwhile, the construction of the new warehouse progressed, and Mark decided it was time to collect another pint of blood. Using the same method, he drew the blood and disposed of the used supplies in a dumpster behind a medical clinic to avoid suspicion. Late one night, Mark advanced his plan further. Wearing gloves, he wiped down the rat poison container, then used Willa's hands while she slept to leave her fingerprints on it. He returned the container to its secure spot in the garage, ensuring the scene looked authentic. On the day of Willa's party, Mark stayed home, parking around the corner until she left for work. Once the house was empty, he began staging the scene. He donned rain gear, poured the blood over himself and the bed, letting it soak into the bedding to mimic a violent injury. Blood dripped onto the floor as he moved around, further selling the illusion. He showered, then placed a bloody knife from Willa's favorite cutlery set back into its block after cleaning it carefully. Mark poured a glass of alcohol, laced it with rat poison, then dumped it down the drain and rinsed the glass, leaving faint traces investigators might notice. He dragged a plastic sheet filled with tools and weighted objects through the house, leaving blood smears and scrape marks leading toward the garage and Dale's usual parking spot. He left a printed note on the table. "Willa, I had to leave on urgent business. Enjoy your birthday and we'll celebrate when I'm back." Mark ensured nothing personal was missing, reinforcing the narrative that he had simply vanished. Before leaving, he placed the investigator's documentation of Willa and Dale's affair in his desk drawer for the police to find. Mark disposed of his rain gear and blood-soaked items in a dumpster behind a liquor store, then returned to hide outside the house and observe. Guests began arriving, including Willa's cousin and the caterer. As the party got underway, Mark waited for the inevitable discovery of bloodstains. It took longer than expected, but eventually, someone noticed, and the commotion began. The chaos began when a police cruiser screeched to a halt outside the Wallace home. Mark, hidden nearby, watched as more officers, guests, and even an ambulance arrived. By 7 o'clock, Dale and Willa pulled up in Dale's pickup, but the cluster of vehicles forced them to park down the street. As they approached the crowd, Mark seized the chance to sneak up to Dale's truck. He discreetly placed a blood-stained piece of plastic and a roll of duct tape with a smear of blood into the truck bed, adding a few drops of blood for good measure before slipping away. A few blocks later, he flagged down a cab, directing it near the construction site of his new warehouse. Walking the rest of the way, he scattered a few more drops of blood on the freshly poured footings, before heading off to a small hotel, paying cash for the room. Mark's plan was simple: stay out of sight for about a week, while suspicion mounted around Willa and Dale. The next morning, he bought a cheap tablet with cash and logged into a social media site via the hotel's public Wi-Fi. He found a post from Willa's cousin, an infamous gossip, detailing the shocking events at the party. The cousin's post described how a caterer had discovered blood on the floor, leading to the bedroom where the bed was drenched in blood. The police were called, locking down the house as more guests arrived. At 7 o'clock, Willa and Dale showed up, seemingly unaware of the scene. Their arrival set tongues wagging, especially after the police immediately separated and questioned them. Speculation spread quickly. Mark was missing, and the bloody bed pointed to foul play, with Willa as the prime suspect. Mark listened to local news updates and confirmed his plan was working. The police labeled Willa and Dale as persons of interest, while the media plastered his photo across TV and newspapers. This unexpected attention forced Mark to adjust his strategy. He removed his phone battery to avoid tracking and decided to grow a beard, a stark contrast to his usual clean-shaven look, to evade recognition. Avoiding familiar places, he purchased second-hand fishing clothes and hopped a bus to a nearby lakeside town. There, Mark rented a small cabin and blended in with local anglers, spending his days on the shore spinning tales of fictional fish he'd almost caught. At night, he watched the news and read the paper, noting that the investigation had gone quiet, though pundits speculated endlessly. The police, as expected, kept their findings under wraps, but the growing suspicion around Willa and Dale made it clear Mark's absence was causing the turmoil he'd planned. The scheme wasn't over yet, but Mark felt a sense of satisfaction watching his carefully laid plans unfold while he stayed hidden in plain sight. The public outrage was palpable. Rumors about Willa and Dale's affair had leaked to the media, who ran with the story, embellishing it with wild speculation. The scandal spread like wildfire, with most people assuming the worst. On social media, Willa's cousin fueled the fire, sharing that Willa's parents had received death threats over Mark's disappearance. Mark felt a twinge of guilt. Her parents had always been kind to him, but quickly buried it. He hadn't anticipated how far-reaching the fallout of his plan might be. Mark's thoughts briefly turned dark. He imagined Willa suffering, not dying, just enduring some hardship. The idea of her and Dale facing consequences for their actions gave him a petty, fleeting satisfaction, but the collateral damage to her family weighed on him. After a week and a half in hiding, Mark caught a news segment about Willa and Dale being indicted for his murder. Intrigued, he searched for updates online and found an article in his hometown paper detailing the case. The district attorney, eager to bolster his re-election campaign, had held a press conference. 2 weeks ago, Mark Wallace, a local businessman, went missing. Evidence at the scene indicates foul play, the DA announced. He described the bloody mattress, drag marks leading outside, and blood residue in the shower drain. DNA tests confirmed the blood matched Mark's. The coroner had concluded, based on the volume of blood, that Mark was likely liquidated in his bed before his body was moved. Additional evidence pointed to foul play. A glass in the dishwasher contained traces of rat poison, with Mark's fingerprints on it. Rat poison was also found in the house, bearing Willa's fingerprints. Investigators discovered a knife with Mark's blood in the cutlery block, as well as a letter on the kitchen table supposedly from Mark, claiming he had to leave town suddenly. However, Mark had taken no clothes or personal items, and his car remained in the garage. The DA revealed further motives. Mark had uncovered evidence of Willa and Dale's affair, and Dale's company, Timmons Electronics, was in financial trouble. Suspiciously, a $1 million life insurance policy on Mark had recently been taken out in Willa's name. Blood traces were also found in Dale's truck, along with a roll of duct tape and plastic sheeting bearing Mark's blood. The DA concluded with a dramatic flourish. Given the motive and evidence, we are seeking a grand jury indictment for capital murder. While this is unusual without a body, we believe the suspects pose a flight risk due to their extensive travel histories and active passports. Mark smirked as he read the article. He'd almost forgotten the DA was up for re-election, and this sensational case was the perfect opportunity to boost his poll numbers. Mark's carefully orchestrated plan was working better than he'd hoped. Willa and Dale were the center of a public scandal, their reputations in tatters. And Mark? He was still out there, watching it all unfold. Mark read the article with satisfaction. A columnist had even penned a scathing opinion piece about infidelity, adding fuel to the fire. But his triumph was tempered by a lingering concern. What would happen when he reappeared alive and well? Could he face legal consequences? He needed to act quickly to control the narrative before the district attorney's reputation took a public hit. Mark took a bus to a nearby town, stopping at a convenience store to buy a prepaid phone. Claiming he'd lost his wallet and phone, he convinced the clerk to sell it without ID. Once activated, he called the police tip line and identified himself. After a pause, a detective came on the line. "This is Detective Mike Rollins. This call is recorded and being traced. How can I help?" "Detective, this is Mark Wallace," Mark said. "I'm calling to assure you and the district attorney that I'm alive and unharmed. The scene at my home was part of a plan to expose my wife's affair with her boss. I never intended for criminal charges to be filed or for anyone but Willa and Dale to face embarrassment." Detective Rollins questioned Mark thoroughly to confirm his identity, explaining they'd had several imposters claiming to be him. Once convinced, Rollins said, "Mr. Wallace, we need you to come in immediately. The DA and the public need to know you're safe. Are you in any danger?" "No, Detective," Mark replied. "I left town a few days after setting everything in motion. No one else was involved in the plan. I wanted to keep it secret and ensure no one else could be implicated if I crossed a legal line. I'm not resisting, but I don't plan to come in just yet." The DA can frame this as a misunderstanding while emphasizing he was following the evidence. The public will understand. Mark hung up before Rollins could respond, removing the phone's battery to avoid being tracked. He spotted a patrol car cruising by as he boarded another bus, relieved when it didn't follow. Back at his cabin, Mark reinserted the battery and called his attorney to explain everything. The attorney was furious. "Mark, this stunt could lead to serious charges. Conspiracy, obstruction, maybe even filing a false police report. You admitted you knew the police would get involved and intended for Willa and Dale to be implicated. You've alienated friends and family who think you're dead. And now Willa could accuse me of collusion because I helped you update your will before all this. How do I prove I wasn't involved?" After venting his frustration, the attorney calmed slightly. "What's your next move?" Mark took a deep breath. "I need to figure out how to come back without making this worse." Mark braced himself as his attorney vented frustration. He didn't interrupt, knowing his friend had every right to be upset. When the rant subsided, Mark said, "First, I'll need representation with the DA. They'll be eager to address this fiasco before another press conference. Second, I'd like you or a divorce specialist to file for divorce from Willa. I imagine she's been ostracized by now, which was the goal, to make her wear the proverbial scarlet letter and have the community turn against her and Dale. And when the timing is right, I want Dale served with alienation of affection papers. He deserves to face consequences for what he did to my marriage." Mark paused as his attorney jotted notes. "I'll also need someone to manage the media storm when I come back. I can't face reporters grilling me about the affair, the party, or the stunt I pulled. I'll leave it to you to figure out how to keep the heat off me." After coordinating with his attorney, Mark called his COO, Kelly Parsons. His first attempt ended with her hanging up, so he routed the call through the office switchboard to ensure she stayed on the line. When Kelly finally answered, Mark said, "Don't hang up again, Kelly. You're too valuable to replace, but I will if I must." "How do I know this is really you?" she asked skeptically. Mark chuckled. My little experiment worked too well. Yes, I know it looks like I was murdered and my body vanished, but I'm alive and well. After verifying his identity with a series of questions, Kelly's skepticism turned into concern. When are you coming back? Have you talked to Willa? I don't know when I'll return, Mark admitted. My attorney is negotiating with the DA to avoid jail time. As for Willa, I've no plans to contact her. She's been using me for financial security while carrying on with Dale. I've had enough. Kelly hesitated before replying. I understand, but I think you should talk to her. Yes, she's been awful to you, but this ordeal has shaken her. Her family has disowned her and she's devastated. She's even worried Dale might have liquidated you and set her up. Mark sighed. I only wanted to humiliate her for what she's done. To me, to our marriage, and to our plans for a family. We built a life together, and she decided she was more important than us. The transcripts and recordings from the investigator proved she doesn't respect me or what we had. I couldn't keep living like that. She had to face consequences. He paused to steady himself. This wasn't the best way to handle it, I admit. But now, even if I lose everything in a divorce, she'll always carry the stigma of being the woman who might have liquidated her husband. The headlines after I reappear won't erase the damage already done. Some people will never believe she didn't try to murder me. Kelly shifted the conversation to business updates. The new warehouse construction was progressing, and police had even scanned the site with ground-penetrating radar, searching for Mark's body. Finances were stable, and Willa had only withdrawn funds to hire an attorney. No other irregularities had been detected. Mark felt some relief. At least his company remained intact despite the chaos. Mark promised Kelly he'd contact Willa to let her know he was alive. Kelly provided Willa's alternate number since her usual phones were overwhelmed with calls, some condemning her, others praising her, and many from reporters. Willa was hiding somewhere in the city under orders from the DA not to leave town. Dale was also in hiding, facing a barrage of death threats. His business was collapsing as customers canceled orders, and his wife, Gretchen, had filed for divorce and obtained a restraining order. Mark was pleased to hear about Dale's troubles. After charging his phone and grabbing lunch at a nearby marina restaurant, Mark prepared to call Willa. Realizing she might not answer a strange number, he reinserted the battery into his personal phone and dialed her new number. She picked up on the third ring, her voice hesitant. Willa, it's Mark, he said plainly. There was silence, then a sudden eruption of sobbing. Willa's cries were so intense Mark couldn't get a word in. He waited until she regained some composure, her voice shaky as she finally spoke. Mark? Is it really you? You sound like him, but others did too. How do I know? Mark reminded her of a private memory from an early date when they'd been caught in a rainstorm during an intimate moment. Relieved, she said, It's you. She explained that over the past week she'd received calls from numbers that appeared to be his, with ghostly voices accusing her of murder. I was going crazy, she admitted. The only reason I answered this time was because Kelly told me you were alive and would call. Her tone shifted, torn between anger and relief. I don't know if I should be happy you're alive or furious at what you've done. I was terrified you were dead, and now I find out it was all a setup. Why, Mark? Have I treated you so badly? Mark kept his voice steady, though his anger simmered. You were sleeping with Dale. You refused to discuss children or build the life we planned. Our marriage became a hollow arrangement while you used our home for comfort and carried on your affair. You didn't care about me, only the business, so your finances were secure. And let's not forget the special treatment Dale got that you never offered me. Before Willa could respond, Mark hung up, powered off the phone, and removed the battery. Exhausted, he collapsed onto the bed. Between the day's events, the tense phone calls, dodging the police, and confronting Willa, his body ached from stress. When he woke, night had fallen. He walked back to the marina for a light meal, pondering his next move. Staying at the cabin any longer wasn't an option. He was bored and restless. It was time to move on. Back at the cabin, Mark turned on the TV, a rare indulgence for him. He flipped through the channels, checking for updates on his case. The news was quiet. No mention of the DA acknowledging he was alive. Mark figured the prosecutor was still strategizing how to save face after being duped. He browsed the TV guide and landed on a rerun of The Fugitive. The show's premise, a man on the run trying to clear his name, felt strangely relevant. But unlike the 1960s, Mark had modern conveniences, access to the internet, his bank accounts, and his attorney. Kelly could handle business affairs remotely, and he could stay in contact without revealing his location. The next morning, Mark began planning an extended trip. The East Coast appealed to him with its rich history and attractions like Boston, Baltimore, and Washington, D.C. He could spend weeks exploring landmarks and museums, especially the Smithsonian. By afternoon, he was ready to leave. On his way out, he gave his fishing gear to a boy he'd noticed lingering near the pier. The child, eager but lacking equipment, was overjoyed by the gift. Mark then bought a bus ticket to the nearest city with an international airport. Over the next year, Mark traveled across the country. Tiring of hotels, he bought a large RV to use as a mobile home. He'd park at RV camps, rent a car, and explore new cities at his own pace. Museums, parks, ball games, professional, college, or even high school filled his days. Occasionally, he'd chat with locals at bars or strike up brief romances with single women, avoiding married ones entirely. He wasn't ready for anything long-term until matters at home were resolved. Meanwhile, Willa fought the divorce, demanding counseling. The judge denied her request, since Mark's location was unknown. She also claimed she deserved a significant share of the business, citing her sacrifices during its early days. Mark's attorney countered with corporate documents proving she had only an advisory role. The judge ruled that Willa would receive quarterly profit distributions, ensuring a comfortable lifestyle, but nothing extravagant. Mark also gave her the house, cars, furniture, and even his tool collection, a settlement substantial enough to satisfy most claims. Willa, surprisingly, had inherited Dale's position at Timmons Electronics after Dale fled amid an SEC investigation into his financial dealings. With no one else to lead, Willa had stepped in and successfully turned the company around, earning the board's full support and a lucrative salary. She no longer needed to siphon resources from Mark's business. Through his attorney, Mark learned Willa wanted a face-to-face meeting to plead her case. After much deliberation, he agreed. He returned to town discreetly, parking his RV in a national forest 100 miles away and taking a bus into the city. Using taxis to move around, he arrived early at the hotel where they were to meet. Scanning the area for anyone who might be watching, he felt reasonably secure. His case was no longer a priority for law enforcement. The new DA, focused on tackling gang violence and a high-profile nightclub shooting, had little interest in pursuing the minor charges left over from Mark's stunt. The embarrassment belonged to the previous administration, and Mark was now just a footnote in the city's history. Mark entered the hotel and joined his attorney in a small meeting room. Shortly after, Willa and her attorney arrived. Introductions were made, and everyone settled in with drinks. Mark sipped his coffee, silently observing Willa. She looked polished but tired, likely from the demands of her job. Willa studied Mark, noticing how different he seemed. Thinner, more rugged, with a groomed goatee and casual but sharp attire, khakis and a button-down shirt instead of his old suit and tie look. Mark broke the silence. "You called for this meeting. Start talking." At her attorney's nod, Willa cleared her throat. "Mark, I want to apologize. Hurting you was never my intention. Dale and I worked long hours together, and it just happened. It wasn't about you. It was about something different. I still love you and want to save our marriage. We can move past this. I've asked for counseling, and I believe we can rebuild what we had. Come home. I haven't touched a thing. Everything is just as you left it." Mark listened, jotting notes on a small pad. When she finished, he held up the page, marked with common excuses for infidelity. "Congratulations, Willa. You've hit most of the classics from the Cheater's Handbook. The only one you missed was, 'It's not you, it's me.' But let's talk about the kids we planned. We're not getting any younger." Willa hesitated. Negotiating deals came naturally to her, but this wasn't a contract. "I just thought we were past that stage, Mark. My job is demanding, 60 to 80 hours a week, and the company barely survived. I don't have time for—" She stopped, realizing the truth wasn't what Mark wanted to hear. Mark leaned forward. "That's the impasse, Willa. I've learned to delegate and trust capable people like Kelly. I'm available for big contracts or emergencies, but otherwise live my life. You've chosen to let Timmons Electronics consume you. Why would I come back to see you even less than when you were sleeping with Dale? And the closeness? Probably even worse." He stood abruptly. "Find someone else to screw in your office." Without waiting for a response, he walked out, heading toward the bus depot with quick, purposeful strides. He felt no regret, only relief. Calling his attorney to finalize the divorce would be his first task once on the bus. For the first time, Mark felt at peace with being single and ready to build a future on his own terms. At the depot, he barely noticed the police cruiser parked outside. As he approached the ticket counter, a voice called out, Sir, are you Mark Wallace? Mark turned to find a patrol officer. Yes, I am. Is something wrong? Mr. Wallace, you're under arrest for false reporting and conspiring to file false charges against Willa Wallace and Dale Timmons. Please place your hands on your head and face the wall. Mark complied, stunned. As the officer handcuffed and searched him, Mark realized Willa must have tipped them off after the meeting. He was taken to the station, booked, and placed in a holding cell to await transfer to jail. No one questioned him or offered explanations. At the jail, Mark was photographed and fingerprinted, but spared the orange jumpsuit. A deputy assured him he'd likely post bail soon. When his attorney arrived, he was already in talks with the assistant DA, negotiating a plea deal to avoid jail time. Mark agreed, knowing it was the cleanest way out. Despite the setback, he resolved to move forward once the ordeal was behind him. Mark stood before the judge for his bail hearing. The main issue was whether he was a flight risk. He admitted that his RV was his only residence and pledged to park it locally to comply with bail conditions. Unexpectedly, another attorney addressed the court. Your Honor, I represent Willa Wallace, Mark's wife. She is willing to cover his bail and proposes house arrest with an ankle monitor to ensure compliance. Mark winced, dreading the thought of being confined with Willa, who he assumed wanted revenge for the public humiliation he had caused her. Mark whispered to his attorney, who relayed his concerns to the judge. Your Honor, my client appreciates his wife's offer but believes it could be motivated by ill intent. He requests alternative accommodations for bail, including surrendering his passport and electronic monitoring, but not at his wife's residence. The judge asked, Is your client prepared to face incarceration if I disagree? Yes, Your Honor. He would rather remain in custody and request a speedy trial. After a brief recess, the judge returned from chambers with the attorneys. Mark's attorney later explained, The judge is sympathetic to your concerns and found your public exposure of Willa's affair amusing. The prosecutor wants to resolve this quickly and quietly. If you plead guilty, the judge is willing to suspend your sentence and place you on probation. Recognizing the risks of trial, Mark agreed. Back in court, he pled guilty to filing a false police report, received a $1,000 fine, and a year of probation. After processing out of jail, Mark called his COO, Kelly Parsons. I'll be in town for a year. Can you arrange to have my RV brought here and secure accommodations? Kelly offered him a choice between 2 furnished apartments in a property owned by the company. Mark selected a spacious third-floor unit, complete with upscale furnishings. Shortly after settling in, his RV and a car were delivered, allowing him to transition comfortably. The next morning, Mark visited the office for the first time in months. He was impressed by the updates Kelly had implemented. While his older employees greeted him warmly, newer ones were more reserved, having heard about his dramatic confrontation with Willa and her lover. In a candid conversation, Kelly asked, Are you returning to lead the company or am I staying in charge? Mark reassured her. You've done an excellent job, better than I could have. The company is thriving and I trust your leadership. I have some ideas to discuss, but I don't plan to take back full control. To show my appreciation, would offering you a percentage of the business help? Kelly smiled, pleased with his support and the offer, which confirmed her value to the company. Mark and Kelly brainstormed ways to expand the company into new cities, focusing on acquiring underutilized properties for development. Mark emphasized that Kelly would remain in charge, but he offered to help secure clients once the expansion began. However, Kelly surprised him with unexpected news. Mark, I want to stay as CEO or COO, but I need some time off. My husband and I have been waiting for the right moment to start a family, and I'm thrilled to share that I'm 6 weeks pregnant. Would you temporarily take over until I'm ready to return? Though hesitant to dive back into full leadership, Mark valued Kelly too much to refuse. Smiling warmly, he replied, Of course, I'll keep your seat warm while you bring the next Parsons into the world. Kelly hugged him and added, One more thing. Would you be the baby's godparent? Humbled, Mark was momentarily speechless but quickly agreed. They celebrated the news before shifting back to planning the company's future. In the following weeks, Mark got up to speed on operations and approved Kelly's local expansion ideas. Because Willa was a co-owner, she was informed of the plans and didn't object. Meanwhile, she repeatedly tried to reconcile with Mark, using various approaches, but he refused. Frustrated, she obtained a court order mandating counseling, which Mark couldn't contest without risking jail time or probation violations. Mark approached the sessions reluctantly, expecting bias from Willa's chosen counselor. However, Dr. Marcia McClellan proved neutral. In their first meeting, she asked about Mark's background, how he and Willa met, and the events leading to their split. She didn't judge him, even when he explained how he had orchestrated Willa's public humiliation. Mark admitted he couldn't let her face false criminal charges, despite his anger, and expressed regret for the unintended damage to her personal relationships. After the emotionally draining session, Mark returned to his condo, poured himself a drink, and took the rest of the day to unwind. During this time, he delegated employees to scout properties in other cities, as probation prevented him from traveling. The arrangement proved beneficial. Mark learned to trust his team, and they gained valuable experience. The first joint counseling session with Willa was tense. Mark deliberately sat where he could observe both Willa and Dr. McClellan. The session began with each recounting how they met and fell in love. Dr. McClellan guided the discussion toward positive memories, including their wedding, and noted that their marriage ceremony didn't appear to be a source of conflict. Before concluding, she assigned them to list disappointments in their marriage, starting from the time they each felt things began to deteriorate. On their way out, Willa asked Mark to come home with her, but he refused and drove off, ensuring she couldn't follow him to his condo. In the next session, Mark opened up about his frustrations, citing Willa's lack of communication, late nights at work, and growing emotional and physical distance. He described how months of these issues had led him to hire an investigator, ultimately uncovering her affair. Dr. McClellan listened intently, steering the conversation toward deeper issues that might have contributed to their marital breakdown. Before their marriage fell apart, Willa believed their relationship was strong despite her affair with Dale. She saw her infidelity as separate from her feelings for Mark and assumed he would overlook her actions. Mark, however, had prepared for her justification. Without saying much, he presented evidence, a video of Willa's post-intimacy conversation with Dale. In the recording, Willa compared Dale favorably to Mark, disparaged her husband's abilities, and admitted she had considered divorcing him when his business struggled. She spoke about cutting Mark off from intimacy to please Dale, and dismissed her marriage as unimportant. The footage left Willa visibly shaken, but Mark remained firm. He couldn't reconcile her words with her claims of love or her insistence on reconciling. He viewed her behavior as manipulative and a sign she wanted control or revenge for how he had exposed her affair. Mark informed Dr. McClellan that continuing counseling sessions seemed pointless unless Willa acknowledged her actions and made meaningful changes. The doctor agreed, suggesting individual sessions might still help both of them process and heal, though reconciliation seemed unlikely. After leaving the counseling office, Mark returned to work, focusing on the company's expansion projects. Willa followed him to the warehouse, demanding another conversation. Reluctantly, Mark agreed and led her to a private meeting room. There, he set clear boundaries, giving her one last chance to say her piece. Her pleas for reconciliation fell flat as Mark, emotionally detached, saw no path forward. Her repeated attempts to justify her actions only solidified his resolve to move on, leaving their marriage as fractured as ever. Willa tried to salvage what was left of their marriage, even though she sensed it was futile. She apologized for the hurtful things Mark had heard, claiming they were never meant for him and were only said to boost Dale's ego. She described how Dale manipulated their affair, pressuring her to cut Mark off from intimacy and dismiss his advances. She admitted to playing along, treating it as a cruel joke at Mark's expense, even mocking his desires with Dale. Mark remained expressionless, though her words cut deeply. Over the past year, he had found some solace in new relationships, none of which ended because of dissatisfaction with him. Still, hearing Willa's callousness reopened old wounds. Willa's voice cracked as she confessed further. She recounted how Dale told her about the surprise birthday party Mark had planned. Instead of appreciating the gesture, they mocked his efforts and had closeness in Dale's office, laughing at Mark's supposed cluelessness. By the time they arrived at the party, Willa was smug, basking in the double life she thought she was pulling off. That confidence quickly shattered when they were met by a crowd murmuring about blood and Mark's disappearance. Initially, Willa dismissed the speculation, chatting with guests about her birthday. But as whispers about Mark's fate grew louder, she realized people were starting to suspect her and Dale. Someone even asked outright what they had done with Mark's body. The police arrived, and Willa's unease turned to dread as she was questioned about their whereabouts earlier that evening. Unable to admit they'd been together in Dale's office, she stumbled over her answers, feeling physically ill as the reality of the situation set in. Willa recounted how her guilt consumed her. Knowing Mark was missing, presumed hurt, or worse, while she was with Dale left her feeling exposed and ashamed. She described being taken into custody, where she learned Mark had known about the affair all along. Detectives presented evidence he had collected, including tapes and videos that highlighted her betrayal. Listening to the recordings broke her spirit. She then detailed how accusations of foul play escalated, with investigators presenting an insurance policy supposedly taken out in Mark's name. Overwhelmed and unable to think clearly, she eventually requested a lawyer to stop the interrogation. Willa's voice trembled as she finished, her composure barely holding, haunted by the events and the damage she had caused. Willa, overwhelmed by emotions, tried to explain her side, though it was clear she was grasping at straws. She began by recounting the days after Mark's disappearance, how the rumors and police investigations made her question everyone around her, even Dale. She recalled being shown blood-stained plastic and duct tape from Dale's truck and being interrogated about their businesses. The discovery of an insurance policy in Mark's name only deepened her suspicion that Dale might have orchestrated the attack. For a week, she lived in turmoil, mourning Mark while feeling completely isolated. Her own family turned against her, believing the gossip that she had a hand in his disappearance. Unable to find peace at home, she was haunted by the sight of bloodstains in their bedroom. When the police found rat poison with her fingerprints, her despair grew. She knew she'd never harm Mark, but she couldn't be sure of Dale's intentions. Their relationship had fallen apart, with barely any communication between them. Dale's life was unraveling too. His wife filed for divorce, customers abandoned his business, and the district attorney announced plans for a grand jury indictment. Willa broke down, asking Mark if he had hated her so much that he wanted to destroy her completely. She described being ostracized by friends, family, and co-workers. Graffiti accusing her of murder appeared on her house, and harassing phone calls, some mimicking Mark's voice, drove her to the brink. Changing her number didn't help. The calls always resumed. When Mark finally revealed he was alive, Willa's emotions were a mix of joy, relief, and anger. She longed to see him, to beg for forgiveness and confront him for terrifying her. But Mark disappeared again, refusing any contact. Rumors spread, with some accusing her of fabricating his survival. Despite the chaos, Mark allowed her access to funds to maintain their home, though he never visited or called. Eventually, Dale left town, and Willa took over Timmons Electronics, working tirelessly to keep it afloat. Finally, she confronted Mark about his demands to start a family. Exhausted, she insisted it wasn't feasible with the demands of running a business. She claimed her responsibilities to the company and its employees left no room for a child or a husband. Yet, she pleaded for Mark's forgiveness, desperate to restore their marriage. Mark listened in silence, his expression unmoved. When she finished, he spoke, his voice calm but firm. He challenged her claims, questioning her vision of their marriage. Did she want the partnership they had once dreamed of, or the hollow version where she prioritized her affair and work over their relationship? He pointed out the contradiction in her desires. She wanted a husband, but admitted to dedicating nearly all her time to her job. Mark refused to settle for being an afterthought in her life. He made it clear he was willing to support her, but not at the expense of his own dignity or happiness. As Willa reached out to him, hoping for a sign of reconciliation, Mark remained distant, his resolve unshaken. Their marriage, once built on love and shared dreams, now seemed irreparably fractured. Mark barely concealed his frustration as he responded to Willa's priorities. He dismissed her claim that Timmons Electronics needed her constant attention, suggesting it might be better off failing if it demanded so much of her life. He reminded her that Dale, its founder, had managed to balance his work while maintaining a relationship with his wife and conducting an affair with her. Mark questioned the usefulness of her management team, suggesting she evaluate her staff and eliminate ineffective leaders. Rising to his feet, Mark made his expectations clear. He wanted a marriage, not a transactional arrangement. He longed for intimate conversations, shared experiences, and a partner who wasn't consumed by work. He wanted love and connection, even if children weren't in the picture. Mark refused to settle for a relationship where he was an afterthought. Before leaving, his tone turned biting. He sarcastically suggested Willa hire someone to fulfill her physical needs and get a dog for companionship, noting a dog would be more loyal and forgiving than he could ever be. Then, without waiting for her response, Mark walked out, leaving Willa alone to grapple with the wreckage of their relationship. Willa sat in silence, overwhelmed by the emptiness of her life. She realized how isolated she had become, with no family, no meaningful connections at work, and a house that felt more like a shell than a home. Mark's words echoed in her mind as she began questioning the value of her sacrifices. Would anyone truly care about the lengths she'd gone to save the business? Over the following days, Willa stopped trying to win Mark back. Their lawyers negotiated a settlement. She sold her share of Wallace Warehouses, giving Mark full ownership. This allowed him to transfer 10% of the company to Kelly Parsons as a reward for her loyalty and leadership. As Kelly took maternity leave, Mark stepped in to manage daily operations. She gave birth to a baby boy, James Mark Parsons, a joy to everyone in their circle. Mark embraced his role as godfather, even though Willa was also named godmother. Despite their history, they found common ground in their shared affection for the child. Willa delighted in her new role and often offered to be an honorary aunt to any future children. Over time, Willa restructured her life. She learned to delegate responsibilities at Timmins Electronics, hired competent managers, and carved out space for herself. While she seldom pursued serious relationships, she occasionally allowed herself a casual companionship to fulfill her needs. After Kelly returned to work and Mark's probation ended, he hit the road again in his RV. Traveling allowed him to explore new locations for warehouse expansions while enjoying life as a tourist. Occasionally, he shared brief, uncomplicated connections with women he met along the way, but he wasn't in a hurry to find another soulmate. Instead, Mark focused on becoming self-sufficient, finding contentment in solitude, and letting any new relationships unfold naturally. Years passed. The business thrived under Mark's leadership, with steady expansions into new markets. He returned home periodically to meet with Kelly and the executive team, ensuring he remained engaged with the company's direction. These visits also gave him time to bond with his godchildren as Kelly expanded her family. Each of her pregnancies saw Mark temporarily taking the reins at the company while she focused on her growing family. Mark became a hands-on godparent, taking the kids on camping trips, teaching them baseball, attending their soccer games, and participating in countless family cookouts. He managed to remain civil with Willa during these gatherings, finding it easier over time to coexist without resentment. Whether Mark remarried or had children of his own remains unknown. What is clear, however, is that he never regretted exposing Willa and Dale's affair. The dramatic act had been a turning point not just for their relationship, but for his own growth and independence. Reflecting on the aftermath, Mark couldn't help but think, for all its fallout, it had been a good, bloody trick.